The alarms in the palace never rang during a wedding. That is what my father always told me, back when I was small enough to believe every word he said. So when the deep horn sound tore through the ceremony hall on the very morning I was set to marry a human soldier, I understood, before anyone spoke a single word, that something had gone terribly wrong. Guards moved in from every side door at once. My own personal escort formed a wall around me, spears lowered, eyes darting toward the tall glass windows that lined the hall. Outside, in the courtyard, I could hear shouting, then silence. Then something worse than shouting, a silence so complete it felt like the whole palace was holding its breath. I turned to look for him, for Ethan, the man I had been told to marry, the man my father called a gift from a defeated enemy, the man I had not yet spoken more than 10 words to in my entire life. He was standing exactly where he had been a moment before, calm, still, hands loosely at his sides, watching the doors instead of the windows. While every guard in the room looked outward for danger, he was the only one who seemed to already know where it would come from. I did not know it then, but that quiet stillness was the first true thing I ever learned about my husband. Everyone else reacted. He watched. The horn stopped. A single guard burst through the side door, breathing hard, and said the words that would begin to unravel everything I believed about the man beside me. An assassin had been found near the northern wall, dressed as one of our own soldiers, carrying a blade meant for me. My father rose from his seat, fury written across every line of his face, but it was Ethan who moved first, not toward the exits, not toward safety. He crossed the hall in a few steps and placed himself, without asking permission from anyone, between me and the doors the guard had come through. I remember staring up at him, this soldier from a species my people had considered beaten, and thinking, for the very first time, that perhaps I did not understand him at all. To explain why that moment surprised me so deeply, I have to go back further, to the day my father first told me about the arrangement. 3 months earlier, I had been called into the high chamber of the Veiled Dominion, the seat of power for my people, built from pale stone that seemed to glow faintly at dusk. My father sat upon the high throne, and beside him stood Kaidan, a prince from a rival house, smiling in the way he always smiled when he believed something amusing was about to happen to someone else. My father told me that the war with the humans, a war that had barely lasted longer than a single season, was ending. Their homeworld, a small blue planet on the edge of a system we had barely bothered to study, had agreed to terms. As part of those terms, they were sending an envoy, a husband, for me. I laughed. I could not help it. My people had fought wars for centuries against enemies far stronger than a species that surrendered after one battle. I imagined this human husband would be some frightened creature, sent to our world as a symbol of submission, a living reminder to any who doubted the strength of the Dominion. Kaidan laughed with me, though his laughter had a different shape to it, sharper, hungrier. He had wanted this marriage for himself, wanted the political weight it carried, and losing it to an alien soldier from a broken world felt, to him, like an insult he intended to enjoy watching unfold. I did not think of Ethan as a person back then. I thought of him as a piece on a board, a small trophy my father had won in a war too short to matter. I remember telling my closest advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mira Thal, that I expected to meet a broken man, someone who would flinch at loud noises and beg for mercy in a language none of us bothered to learn properly. Mira warned me, gently, that assumptions built on pride tend to crack at the worst possible moment. I did not listen. I was young, and certain, and surrounded by people who agreed with everything I believed. The day Ethan arrived, the entire court gathered to see him, the way people gather to see something rare and strange, expecting either fear or begging. Instead, a man walked into the hall on his own feet, without chains, without guards holding him at either side, wearing simple clothing instead of the ceremonial robes we had prepared for him. He was not what I expected. He was quiet. His eyes moved across the room once, taking in every exit, every guard, every face, before settling on me. He bowed, not deeply, not with fear, but with a kind of calm respect that felt entirely unfamiliar to me. Then he simply waited. I asked him, through a translator device fixed to my collar, whether he understood what this marriage meant. He answered in careful, simple words, saying that he understood it meant peace between our people, and that he intended to honor it. Peace, not surrender, not submission. He used the word peace, and something about the steadiness in his voice made a few of the older advisors in the room shift uncomfortably, though I did not yet understand why. Kaidan, standing near the back of the hall, made a joke about the size of human soldiers compared to our own warriors, loud enough for the whole court to hear. Several nobles laughed. Ethan did not react at all. He simply looked at Kaidan for a long moment, the way someone looks at a small dog that has just barked at something much larger than itself, and then looked away, unbothered. That silence unsettled me more than any angry response could have. I had grown up around warriors who postured, who raised their voices, who needed everyone to know how dangerous they were. Ethan did none of that. He simply existed, quiet and unreadable, and somehow that made the room feel smaller around him. In the weeks that followed, I watched him from a careful distance, trying to understand what kind of creature had been given to me. He rose early, before even the palace servants, and spent time in the gardens behind my private wing, tending to plants that had been neglected for years. He fixed a broken irrigation system with his own hands, something none of our engineers had bothered to repair because it was considered beneath their station. He spoke to the servants with the same respect he showed the nobles, sometimes more. I once saw him help an elderly groundskeeper carry a heavy container of water, simply because the man was struggling, without being asked, without expecting anyone to notice or reward him for it. I began to think my father had sent me the gentlest, most harmless human on his entire planet. Perhaps, I thought, this was some kind of insult after all, not from Ethan himself, but from whoever had chosen him. A soldier who gardened and helped old men carry water did not fit my idea of a warrior. I remember saying as much to Mira one evening as we watched him from the balcony above the garden. She did not answer right away. She simply watched him work, his sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands, calm and unhurried, and said something I did not understand until much later. She said that the quietest creatures were often the ones whose stillness had been earned the hard way, through experiences the rest of us had never had to survive. I dismissed the comment. I told her she was reading too much into a man who spent his mornings talking to garden plants. The wedding itself was arranged for the following season, a political spectacle meant to show every house in the Dominion that peace with the humans was permanent and secure. I approached it the way I approached most obligations placed on me since childhood, with duty rather than feeling, expecting nothing from the man standing beside me except quiet cooperation. I did not expect to feel anything at all on that morning, dressed in ceremonial robes, the color of pale gold, standing in the great hall while the entire court watched. I certainly did not expect the horn to sound, or the guards to rush in, or Ethan to move between me and danger before I had even fully understood there was danger to move from. As the guard finished explaining what had happened near the northern wall, my father demanded to know how an assassin had gotten so close to the ceremony undetected. Kaidan, standing near the front of the hall, expressed loud outrage, calling for the guards responsible to be punished immediately, his voice carrying just a little too much performance in it for my taste. Ethan said nothing during any of this. He simply turned to me, still positioned between me and the doors, and asked, in that same steady voice, whether I was unharmed, not whether the ceremony would continue, not whether the political situation would be damaged, whether I was unharmed. I told him I was fine. He nodded once, then turned back toward the doors, watching them the way he had been watching them since the horn first sounded, as though he had expected trouble from that direction all along. Later that evening, once the ceremony had been rescheduled and the assassin taken into custody, I found myself sitting alone in my private chamber, turning the morning over in my mind. I thought of Kaidan's loud outrage, so quick and so convenient. I thought of the guards who claimed no one had seen the assassin approach, despite the northern wall being one of the most heavily watched sections of the palace grounds. Mostly, I thought of Ethan, standing perfectly still while chaos moved around him, the only person in that entire hall who had seemed to already know exactly where the danger would come from. I had spent months believing my husband was harmless, a gentle gardener sent to me as either a gift or an insult, depending on how one chose to see it. That night, for the first time, I began to wonder if I had misunderstood him from the very beginning, and if the true danger in my life was not the assassin who had been caught, but the people around me who had known something I did not. I did not yet know how right that fear would turn out to be. The rescheduled wedding took place 7 days later, in a smaller hall, with far fewer guests, and a great deal more armed guards standing along every wall. My father insisted on this caution, though he refused to publicly admit that the assassination attempt had shaken him as deeply as it had shaken me. This time, the ceremony proceeded without interruption, and by evening, Ethan and I were formally bound as husband and wife under Dominion law. I expected our life together to remain distant and formal, a political arrangement dressed up as a marriage. For the first several weeks, that is exactly what it was. We shared meals in near silence. He asked polite questions about Dominion customs, and I answered them out of obligation rather than interest. I still believed, somewhere beneath my growing curiosity, that he was simply a gentle man who had been given to me as either reward or punishment, depending on which noble you asked. It was during those quiet weeks that I began noticing small details I had overlooked before. Ethan never sat with his back fully toward a door. He always seemed to know exactly how many guards stood outside our chambers, without ever appearing to check. When servants dropped something heavy in a nearby hallway, he would go still for half a breath before relaxing again, as though some old instinct had briefly taken hold of him before releasing its grip. I asked Mira about these habits one afternoon, expecting her to dismiss them the way she had dismissed my earlier comment about his gardening. Instead, she grew quiet, thoughtful, and told me that such habits were not the marks of a gentle man at all. They were the marks of someone who had lived through danger so often that his body had learned to prepare for it without his mind needing to ask. I did not fully believe her. I had grown up around Dominion warriors my entire life, loud and proud creatures who wore their strength like ceremonial armor, impossible to miss. Ethan wore nothing like that. If he carried strength within him, he kept it as quiet as everything else about him. The truth came to me on a hunting expedition arranged by my father, meant to celebrate the marriage and reassure the nobility that peace between our peoples had not weakened the Dominion in any way. Such hunts were tradition among my family, held in the great preserve east of the palace, where dangerous creatures were allowed to roam within controlled boundaries for sport and ceremony. I had hunted in that preserve since childhood, always surrounded by armed escorts, always kept far from any real risk, despite the appearance of danger. I assumed this hunt would be no different, a performance meant to entertain the nobles rather than a genuine test of anyone's courage. Kaidan joined the hunting party that day, uninvited by me but impossible to exclude given his standing among the noble houses. He rode close beside my father for most of the morning, laughing loudly at every joke, offering compliments that felt just slightly too eager. I paid him little attention. My focus remained on Ethan, who rode near the back of our group, watching the tree line with the same quiet alertness he showed everywhere else. We had been riding for perhaps 2 hours, when the guides informed us that a young Krith beast had wandered into the hunting grounds from the wilder forest beyond the preserve's boundary. Such creatures were rare within controlled hunting territory, and dangerous enough that even our most experienced warriors treated encounters with them carefully. A single Krith, fully grown, had once ended the lives of 40 trained guards during a border patrol decades earlier, a story every Dominion child learned before they were old enough to hold a weapon. My father, perhaps eager to prove that peace with the humans had not softened the Dominion's warrior spirit, insisted we track the creature rather than retreat to safer ground. Several nobles voiced quiet concern, but none dared openly disagree with the king. Kaidan, notably, encouraged the pursuit with great enthusiasm, suggesting it would make for a memorable story to tell at court. I did not think much of his enthusiasm at the time. I understand now that I should have. We tracked the beast for nearly an hour before the guides lost its trail near a dense section of forest close to a rocky ravine. The hunting party spread out to search the surrounding area, a decision that, in hindsight, placed several smaller groups of nobles and guards in vulnerable positions without realizing it. I found myself in a smaller group with my father, a handful of guards, Kaidon and Ethan, moving along a narrow path bordered by tall grass on one side and a steep drop into the ravine on the other. The guides had assured us the beast typically avoided open paths such as this one, preferring the cover of dense trees. The guides were wrong. The Krith emerged from the tall grass without warning, faster than anything I had ever witnessed move, a mass of dark scales and powerful limbs that closed the distance between itself and our group before most of the guards had even drawn their weapons. It moved directly toward me, whether by instinct or simple proximity I never learned, and for one terrible moment I understood that I was about to experience the true danger my entire life of ceremonial hunts had always protected me from. I do not fully remember deciding to freeze. My body simply stopped responding to any command my mind attempted to give it. The guards nearest to me shouted, weapons rising too slowly, my father's voice calling my name from somewhere that suddenly felt very far away. Ethan reached me before the beast did. He did not draw a weapon. He did not call for help. He simply moved, faster than I believed a human body capable of moving, placing himself directly between me and the charging creature, with the same calm he had shown standing beside a garden or waiting silently through a formal dinner. What happened next took only a few seconds, though it felt, to me, as though time had slowed to allow me to witness every single moment of it clearly. The Krith lunged, jaws wide, aiming for the space where Ethan stood. He did not retreat. Instead, he moved to the side at the last possible instant, redirecting the creature's enormous weight with a precise motion of his own body, guiding its charge past him rather than attempting to meet its full force directly. As the beast's momentum carried it forward, off balance for the briefest moment, Ethan struck a single point along its foreleg with a speed and accuracy that seemed impossible for someone who spent his mornings tending garden plants. The Krith stumbled, its massive body crashing into the tall grass beside the path, disoriented rather than seriously harmed. Before it could recover, Ethan had already moved again, positioning himself between the creature and both myself and my father, his stance calm, controlled, entirely unlike the panic that had gripped every other person present. The guards finally reached us then, weapons drawn, forming a defensive line around the stunned beast, which soon retreated back into the tall grass rather than risk another confrontation. The entire encounter had lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt, to everyone who witnessed it, like something closer to an hour. I stood frozen for a long moment afterward, staring at my husband as though seeing him for the very first time. The calm gardener who fixed irrigation systems and helped elderly servants carry water had just disabled one of the most dangerous creatures in the entire preserve with his bare hands, without hesitation, without fear, and without a single wasted movement. My father approached him first, breathing heavily, his earlier eagerness for adventure replaced entirely by something closer to shock. He asked Ethan, in a voice unlike any I had heard him use before, where a gardener had learned to move like that. Ethan's answer was simple. He said that appearances could be misleading, and that he would explain more once we returned safely to the palace. He did not boast. He did not seem proud of what he had done. He simply helped steady one of the shaken guards, checked to make sure no one else had been injured during the encounter, and waited quietly for the hunting party to regroup. Kaidon said very little during the ride back to the palace, his earlier enthusiasm for the hunt replaced by a watchful silence that I noticed, but did not yet understand the significance of. I remember catching him glancing toward Ethan several times, his expression unreadable in a way that felt deliberately guarded. That evening, once we returned to our private chambers, I finally asked Ethan the question that had been building inside me since the moment the Krith charged toward us. I asked him who he truly was, and why a species that had surrendered after a single battle had sent me a husband capable of disabling a creature that had once ended the lives of 40 trained guards. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. He told me that Earth's surrender had never truly been about weakness. He explained, carefully and without exaggeration, that he had served for many years in some of the most difficult conflict zones his own world had ever known, long before the Dominion's fleet ever arrived in Earth's system. He told me that when his leaders learned of the Dominion's approach, they made a deliberate choice to offer peace immediately, rather than allow a war to unfold that neither side would walk away from unchanged. He said something then that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. He said that his people had not been sent to prove they could not fight. They had been sent to prove they had chosen not to, and that the difference between those two things mattered more than anyone in my father's court had bothered to consider. I sat with that thought long into the night, replaying the moment the Krith lunged toward me, replaying the calm, controlled way Ethan had moved to protect me without a shred of hesitation. I thought of Kaidan's strange silence during the ride home and the eagerness with which he had encouraged the pursuit of a dangerous creature into an area our guides had assured us was safe. For the first time since Ethan had walked into that ceremony hall months earlier, I did not see a harmless man standing beside me. I saw someone whose calm had been earned through experiences I had never imagined, and I began to wonder, with a growing unease I could not quite name, whether the true danger surrounding our marriage had only just begun to reveal itself. In the days following the hunt, word of what happened in the preserve spread through the palace faster than any official announcement could have managed. Servants whispered about it in the kitchens. Guards discussed it quietly during shift changes. By the time a full week had passed, nearly everyone in the Dominion court had heard some version of the story, though the details grew more exaggerated with each retelling. I did not correct any of the rumors. I found myself, strangely, protective of the truth, unwilling to let it become another piece of court gossip to be picked apart and mocked. What had happened in that clearing belonged to me and to Ethan, and I was not yet ready to share it freely with people who had spent months treating my husband as a joke. Ethan himself seemed unbothered by the attention, though I noticed he had grown slightly more careful in public spaces, watching entrances and exits with even sharper focus than before. When I asked him about this change, he told me that once people learn what someone is capable of, they begin to see that person differently, and not everyone reacts to that knowledge with respect. He was right to be cautious. Kaidan's behavior toward us shifted noticeably in the weeks that followed. Where he had once been openly mocking, loud with his jokes about human weakness, he became quiet, watchful, almost courteous in a way that unsettled me more than his earlier rudeness ever had. I mentioned this change to Mira one evening, and she agreed that something about Kaidan's new demeanor felt calculated rather than genuine. I began paying closer attention to him during court gatherings, noticing small things I had previously dismissed. He often left formal dinners early, claiming urgent business elsewhere. He met privately with several nobles from smaller, less powerful houses, families who had long resented my father's growing alliance with Earth. He asked pointed questions about palace security schedules during casual conversations, questions that seemed harmless on their own, but troubling when considered together. I brought my concerns to my father, but he dismissed them as the anxious imagination of a young wife still adjusting to a new marriage. He reminded me that Kaidan came from one of the oldest and most respected houses in the Dominion, and that accusing him of wrongdoing without solid proof would create exactly the kind of political instability the human alliance was meant to prevent. Ethan listened to my frustration that night without offering easy comfort or dismissing my concerns the way my father had. Instead, he asked careful questions, wanting to understand the structure of Dominion politics, the histories between noble houses, the specific grievances that families like Kaidan's held against my father's rule. He explained that, in his own experience, threats rarely announced themselves clearly. They built slowly, through small actions that seemed insignificant until they suddenly were not. I asked him directly, during that conversation, to tell me more about the conflicts he had survived on Earth before coming to the Dominion. I wanted to understand the man standing beside me, not the quiet gardener I had imagined months earlier, but the soldier who had moved without hesitation to save my life in that clearing. He answered honestly, though carefully, choosing his words the way someone chooses steps across unstable ground. He told me that his homeworld had suffered many years of conflict long before the Dominion's fleet ever appeared. Wars fought over resources, over old grievances, over pride that refused to bend even when bending would have saved countless lives. He had served through several of the worst of these conflicts, in roles he did not describe in detail, though the weight in his voice told me enough about what those years had cost him. He told me that by the time Earth's leaders learned of the Dominion's approach, his people had already learned hard lessons about the true cost of unnecessary conflict. When the choice came between fighting a war they might win at devastating cost, or offering peace immediately and absorbing whatever insult came with it, his leaders chose peace without hesitation. He had volunteered for this assignment specifically because his experience made him uniquely suited to protect whatever bridge that peace required, even if it meant being underestimated by an entire foreign court. I asked him whether it bothered him being seen as harmless for so long, being laughed at by nobles who assumed his calm nature meant weakness. He considered the question for a long moment before answering that it had never bothered him personally. He said that being underestimated had, in his experience, always been more useful than being feared, because people reveal their true intentions far more easily around someone they do not consider a threat. That answer stayed with me long after our conversation ended. I began to understand that Ethan's quiet nature was not simply a personality trait. It was a tool, deliberately maintained, one that had allowed him to observe the Dominion court far more closely than anyone realized, myself included. Over the following weeks, I noticed him growing quietly attentive to details I had never considered significant. He memorized the schedules of palace guards, learning which shifts were staffed by experienced soldiers and which were left to newer recruits. He noted which servants moved freely between different sections of the palace, and which areas remained restricted even to trusted staff. He asked me detailed questions about the layout of the northern wall, the same section of the palace where the assassin had been discovered on our original wedding day. I asked him once why he focused so much attention on that particular section of the grounds. He told me that the assassin's presence there had never fully made sense to him. The northern wall was among the most heavily guarded areas of the entire palace, patrolled constantly by experienced soldiers, loyal directly to my father. For an outside attacker to slip through undetected would have required either extraordinary skill or help from someone already trusted within those defenses. The implication settled over me slowly, heavy and unwelcome. Someone inside the palace, someone with access to guard schedules and security routines, had likely helped the assassin reach that position undetected. I thought immediately of Kaidan, though I reminded myself that suspicion was not the same as proof, and that accusing a powerful noble without solid evidence could unravel far more than it repaired. Ethan agreed that caution mattered, but he also began quietly gathering information of his own, careful never to draw attention to what he was doing. He spent time speaking with guards during shift changes, treating them with the same respect he showed everyone else, earning small pieces of trust that gradually turned into small pieces of useful information. He noted which guards seemed nervous discussing the Northern Wall incident, and which spoke about it freely without hesitation. During one such conversation, a younger guard mentioned, almost in passing, that Kaidan's personal attendant had requested access to restricted maintenance tunnels beneath the Northern Wall several days before our original wedding date, claiming it was needed for ceremonial preparations. No formal ceremony had ever required access to those tunnels before. Ethan filed this detail away without reacting visibly, careful not to alert anyone to the significance of what he had just learned. He shared this information with me privately that evening, laying out the pieces slowly, methodically, the way someone builds a case rather than simply voicing a suspicion. The maintenance tunnels beneath the northern wall connected to several points along the palace perimeter, including sections that would have been far easier for an outside attacker to access without detection. If Kaidan's attendant had requested access to those tunnels under a false pretense, it suggested a level of planning that reached well beyond a single assassin acting alone. I asked Ethan directly whether he believed Kaidan intended more than a single failed attempt on my life. He answered carefully, telling me that in his experience, people who plan political violence rarely stop after a single failed attempt, especially when the stakes involved an entire alliance between two civilizations. If Kaidan's ambitions extended toward breaking the peace between Earth and the Dominion, a single assassination attempt was unlikely to be his only strategy. That conversation left me unable to sleep for much of the night. I found myself staring at the ceiling of our chambers, turning over every interaction I had ever had with Kaidan, searching for signs I might have missed. I thought of his loud enthusiasm during the hunt, his strange silence during the ride home afterward, his newfound courtesy toward Ethan that felt calculated rather than genuine. I also found myself thinking, with growing clarity, about how deeply I had misjudged the man lying quietly beside me. Months earlier, I had believed Ethan to be harmless, perhaps even an insult delivered by a defeated enemy. Now I understood that his calm nature had never been weakness. It had been patience, discipline, and quiet observation, qualities that made him more dangerous to those who wished me harm than any warrior in my father's entire court. I asked him, in the darkness of that room, whether he regretted being sent so far from his own world into a marriage neither of us had chosen for ourselves. He answered without hesitation, telling me that regret required believing something better had been possible, and that from where he stood, protecting a fragile peace between two civilizations and protecting me alongside it felt like exactly the purpose he had been meant for. I did not fully understand, that night, how soon those words would be tested. I only knew that the quiet man my court had once mocked was, in truth, the only person standing firmly between me and whatever Kaidan intended to unleash next. Over the following days, Ethan and I moved carefully, gathering small pieces of evidence without drawing attention to ourselves. He spoke to more guards, always casually, always without suspicion. I spoke quietly with Mira, who had her own connections among the palace staff and noble houses, and who agreed to help us listen for anything unusual without revealing why. Slowly, a picture began to form, one that suggested Kaidan's ambitions reached far beyond simple political rivalry. He had been meeting privately with disgruntled noble families for months, families who resented my father's alliance with Earth, and who believed a war with the humans, even a costly one, would restore the Dominion's traditional dominance rather than share power with a species they still considered inferior, despite everything Ethan had already demonstrated. I realized, with growing dread, that Kaidan was not simply hoping the human alliance would fail on its own. He intended to make certain it did, by whatever means necessary, and the first attempt on my life during our original wedding ceremony had likely been only the beginning of a much larger plan. Ethan remained calm through all of this, though I noticed him growing more alert with each passing day, watching entrances more carefully, spending more time near the areas of the palace he considered vulnerable. He told me, quietly, that whatever Kaidan intended next, we would need to be ready before it happened, rather than reacting after the fact. I trusted him completely by then, in a way I had not thought myself capable of trusting anyone so quickly. The gentle gardener I had once dismissed had become, in my eyes, the only truly steady presence in a court full of hidden ambitions and quiet betrayals, and I understood, with growing certainty, that whatever came next would test both of us in ways neither of us could fully predict. The opportunity Kaidan had been waiting for arrived in the form of the founding ceremony, an ancient Dominion tradition held once every several years to honor the first treaty that united the noble houses under a single crown. Every family of standing was expected to attend, along with representatives from allied worlds, making it one of the few occasions when the entire palace opened its doors to nearly all of Dominion society at once. My father saw the ceremony as the perfect opportunity to showcase the strength of the human alliance publicly, hoping to silence the lingering doubts that still circulated among certain noble houses. He announced that Ethan and I would stand together at the center of the ceremony, presented formally as proof that peace with Earth had brought stability rather than weakness to the Dominion. Ethan grew quiet when he learned of this plan. He told me, once we were alone, that a large public gathering, filled with unfamiliar faces and complex security arrangements, created exactly the kind of opportunity someone like Kaidon would find difficult to resist. Too many guards would be spread too thin across too large an event, and too many outside guests would make it easy for a hidden threat to slip through unnoticed. I brought these concerns to my father once more, along with the small pieces of evidence Ethan and I had quietly gathered over the previous weeks. This time, perhaps because the memory of the Northern Wall incident still lingered uncomfortably in his mind, my father listened more carefully than before. He agreed to increase security around the ceremony, though he refused to cancel or postpone it, insisting that showing fear in front of the entire Dominion would cause far more damage than any single threat could. Ethan accepted this decision without argument, though I could see him already planning quietly for whatever might come. In the days leading up to the ceremony, he spent long hours walking the grounds where the event would be held, memorizing every entrance, every hidden corridor, every point where a large crowd might create confusion useful to someone with harmful intentions. He also continued his quiet conversations with guards and staff members, gathering small details that, combined, painted an increasingly troubling picture. Several guards mentioned unusual shipments arriving at the palace in the days before the ceremony, crates labeled as decorative supplies for the event, delivered by workers none of the regular staff recognized. Kaidon's attendant had personally overseen the placement of several of these crates within the ceremony hall itself, an unusual level of personal involvement for a task normally handled by lower staff. Ethan shared this information with me the night before the ceremony, laying out his concerns carefully. He believed the crates likely contained something other than decorations, possibly weapons or explosive devices meant to create chaos during the event itself. Chaos that could be used to eliminate both myself and my father while appearing, to outside observers, like an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate act of betrayal. I asked him what we should do. He told me that confronting Kaidon directly, without solid proof, would only allow him time to destroy evidence and prepare a new plan. Instead, Ethan proposed a quieter approach. He would examine the crates himself, early the next morning before the ceremony began, using the same quiet, unassuming manner that had allowed him to move through the palace unnoticed for months. I insisted on accompanying him, despite his initial reluctance. He eventually agreed, on the condition that I remain close behind him and follow his instructions without hesitation if anything went wrong. I trusted him completely by then, and I understood that this was no longer a matter of politics or pride. It was a matter of survival, for both of us, and for the fragile peace our marriage represented. We entered the ceremony hall before dawn, while most of the palace still slept. The hall itself had been transformed for the occasion, filled with decorative banners, ceremonial seating arranged in careful rows, and the crates Ethan had been concerned about, stacked near the base of the central platform where my father and I were meant to stand during the ceremony's opening remarks. Ethan approached the crates carefully, examining their construction with a focus I had rarely seen from him before. He noted the unusual weight of several crates compared to what their labels claimed to contain, and small details in their construction that suggested they had been built quickly, without the careful craftsmanship typically found in genuine decorative supplies. He opened one crate slowly, revealing not decorative materials, but a compact device I did not recognize, wired with components that even I, with no military training, understood immediately could not be anything harmless. Ethan studied the device for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before telling me quietly that it was designed to be triggered remotely, likely timed to activate during the ceremony's most crowded moment, when the largest number of guests, along with myself and my father, would be gathered directly around the central platform. I felt a cold fear settle over me unlike anything I had experienced before, even during the Kreeth attack in the preserve. That danger had been sudden, unexpected, a wild creature acting on instinct. This was different. This had been planned, carefully, deliberately, by someone within our own court who had smiled at me during formal dinners while quietly preparing to end my life along with my father's. Ethan remained calm through the discovery, his focus already shifting toward what needed to happen next. He told me that disarming the device carefully, without alerting whoever monitored it remotely, would allow us to gather proof of Kaidan's involvement while ensuring no one else discovered the plot before we were ready to act. If we moved too quickly, too visibly, Kaidan would have time to distance himself from the plan, potentially escaping consequences entirely while placing blame on someone else. Working with a steady focus I found difficult to fully comprehend, Ethan carefully disabled the device, examining its internal components with the same quiet expertise he had shown while healing wounded soldiers or fixing broken irrigation systems in the garden. He explained, as he worked, that certain components within the device matched manufacturing techniques used by a smaller noble house known to align closely with Kaidan's interests, providing another thread connecting the plot directly back to him. Once the device had been safely disabled, Ethan carefully repacked the crate to appear undisturbed, ensuring that whoever monitored the situation remotely would have no reason to suspect their plan had been discovered. We left the hall quietly, taking with us the small components Ethan had removed from the device, evidence that would prove essential in exposing the full scope of Kaidan's betrayal. Ethan brought this evidence directly to my father later that morning, along with the detailed account of unusual shipments, restricted tunnel access requests, and quiet meetings with disgruntled noble families that we had gathered over the previous weeks. My father listened in stunned, growing anger as the full picture assembled itself before him, a picture that made clear Kaidan had been planning to eliminate both his king and his princess in order to seize power and unravel the human alliance entirely. Rather than confronting Kaidan immediately, which risked alerting any allies he still had within the palace, my father agreed to Ethan's suggestion of allowing the ceremony to proceed as planned, while quietly replacing the guards assigned to the ceremony hall with soldiers personally loyal to the crown, soldiers who understood the situation and knew precisely where to watch for trouble. The ceremony began that afternoon, exactly as originally planned, with Ethan and I standing together at the center of the hall, surrounded by nobles, allied representatives, and the very crates that had, only hours earlier, contained a device meant to end our lives. Kaidan stood among the gathered nobles, smiling with practiced calm, entirely unaware that his plan had already been discovered and disarmed. At the moment when the ceremony reached its most crowded point, precisely when Ethan had predicted the device would have been triggered, my father rose and addressed the entire gathered court, revealing calmly and clearly the plot that had been uncovered against the crown. Guards moved swiftly through the crowd, securing not only Kaidan himself, but several of the noble allies who had conspired alongside him. Kaidan's calm expression shattered entirely in that moment, replaced by open shock, as he realized his plan had failed, not through carelessness on his part, but through the quiet, careful work of the very man he had spent months mocking as harmless and weak. He looked toward Ethan across the crowded hall, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear cross his features. The ceremony ended not with celebration, but with the arrest of a prince who had nearly succeeded in destroying both the Dominion crown and the fragile peace between our two civilizations. As guards led Kaidan from the hall, I found myself standing beside Ethan, both of us finally allowed to breathe freely after weeks of quiet, careful vigilance. I looked up at him then, this man I had once dismissed as harmless, and understood fully, for the first time, exactly how much I owed him. Not simply my life, though that alone would have been enough, but the survival of an alliance that meant far more than either of us as individuals. He had done all of this quietly, without seeking recognition, motivated entirely by a sense of duty and protection that ran far deeper than any performance of strength I had witnessed among my own people. I asked him, once the hall had finally emptied and the guards had escorted the last of the conspirators away, how he had remained so calm through everything, knowing the stakes involved. He told me simply that panic solved nothing, and that the people who needed protecting deserved someone steady enough to protect them properly, regardless of how frightening the circumstances became. I did not yet know how deeply that steadiness would shape everything that came next, or how the court, that had once mocked my human husband would soon be forced to see him exactly as he truly was. In the days following Kaidan's arrest, the palace felt like a different place entirely. Where whispers had once circulated about the harmless human husband forced upon the princess, new whispers now spread about the quiet soldier who had uncovered a plot against the crown before it could ever unfold. I noticed the shift in how guards looked at Ethan, how servants greeted him, how nobles who had once barely acknowledged his presence now watched him with a careful, uncertain respect. Not everyone welcomed this change. Several noble houses, particularly those who had quietly aligned themselves with Kaidan's ambitions without directly participating in the plot itself, saw the situation as an opportunity to attack rather than accept. Within a week of the arrest, my father called for a full council session, gathering the heads of every major noble house to address the fallout from the failed conspiracy, and, more specifically, to decide what should be done about the human soldier who had exposed it. I attended that council session alongside Ethan, understanding that whatever happened within that chamber would shape not only our marriage, but the future of the entire alliance between Earth and the Dominion. Several council members spoke first, praising my father's leadership and expressing relief that the plot had been discovered before any harm could occur. Their words felt careful, measured, clearly designed to avoid drawing attention to how close the Dominion had come to losing both its king and its princess. Then a council member from one of the older, more traditional houses rose to speak, a woman named Sela Vorn, whose family had long resented the growing influence humans held within Dominion affairs even before Ethan's arrival. She acknowledged, carefully, that the human soldier had indeed prevented a serious threat to the crown. However, she raised a concern that several other council members quietly nodded along to as she spoke. She argued that a human capable of such quiet, precise skill, someone who had moved through the palace for months, gathering information without anyone noticing, represented a different kind of danger entirely. If a human could uncover a plot this thoroughly without detection, what might prevent a human, someday, from orchestrating one just as quietly? She suggested, diplomatically but unmistakably, that perhaps it would be wiser to send Ethan back to his homeworld, replacing him with a symbolic figure less capable of operating so effectively within Dominion politics. The chamber grew tense as she finished speaking. Several council members voiced quiet agreement, while others, including Mira, who had been granted a seat at the council specifically because of her role in uncovering the conspiracy alongside us, rose immediately to object. The disagreement threatened to divide the room entirely, each side pulling toward a different vision of what safety for the Dominion actually required. I felt the weight of the moment settle over me as I realized this was not simply a debate about politics or tradition. It was a decision about whether the very qualities that had saved my life and my father's would now be treated as a threat rather than a strength, simply because they came from someone born on a distant, unfamiliar world. I rose from my seat before my father could respond, understanding that whatever I said in that moment would matter more than anything I had spoken in that chamber before. I addressed Sela Vorn directly, along with the rest of the gathered council, choosing my words carefully, drawing on everything I had learned over the past months about the man standing quietly beside me. I told them that I had once believed, exactly as many of them still believed, that Ethan's calm nature reflected weakness rather than strength. I admitted, openly, that I had mocked that same quiet demeanor in private, certain that my father had been given a harmless soldier as either a gift or an insult from a defeated world. I told them how wrong that assumption had been, and how dangerous it remained for the Dominion to continue underestimating a species that had chosen peace not because they lacked the strength to fight, but because they understood, more clearly than we did, the true cost such a fight would carry for both sides. I reminded the council of the Krith attack in the preserve, where Ethan's quick, decisive action had saved not only my life, but potentially my father's as well, given how close the beast had come to reaching us both. I reminded them, too, of the Northern Wall incident, and how Ethan's careful attention to overlooked details had ultimately unraveled a plot that our own trusted guards and advisors had failed to detect for weeks. I told the council that sending Ethan away simply because his skill made certain traditional houses uncomfortable, would not make the Dominion safer. It would make us blind, removing the very person who had proven capable of seeing dangers the rest of us consistently failed to notice, all because his strength did not match the loud, boastful performance we had grown accustomed to expecting from warriors within our own culture. Ethan remained quiet throughout my address, though I could feel his attention fully focused on every word I spoke. When I finished, the chamber fell into a heavy silence, broken eventually by my father himself, who rose from his throne and addressed the council with a firmness I had rarely heard him use before. He told the assembled nobles that he had personally witnessed Ethan's actions during both the hunting expedition and the ceremony hall investigation, and that he would not allow tradition or discomfort with unfamiliar strength to override sound judgment regarding the safety of the crown. He declared, formally and without room for further debate, that Ethan would remain not only as my husband, but as a trusted advisor on matters of palace security, a role that would allow his skills to continue benefiting the Dominion openly, rather than quietly, unnoticed, from the shadows of assumed harmlessness. Sella Vorn did not appear entirely satisfied with this decision, though she offered no further public objection, understanding perhaps that pressing the matter further would only strengthen the growing respect Ethan had earned rather than diminish it. The council session ended with my father's decision standing firm, and with a quiet shift in the room, as several nobles who had previously mocked Ethan behind closed doors now offered him careful, if somewhat reluctant nods of acknowledgement. In the weeks that followed, Ethan settled into his new role with the same quiet dedication he had shown in everything else since his arrival. He worked closely with palace guards, sharing techniques and strategies drawn from his years of experience on Earth, techniques that gradually improved the overall readiness and awareness of the Dominion's own security forces. He remained humble throughout this process, never positioning himself as superior to the guards he trained, always framing his knowledge as something learned through difficult experience rather than natural superiority. I found myself, during this time, growing closer to him in ways that had nothing to do with politics or duty. We spent quiet evenings together in the garden he had once tended alone, where he told me more about his homeworld, about the family he had left behind, about the long years of conflict that had shaped him into the calm, careful person I now understood him to be. I shared, in turn, stories of my own upbringing, the pressures of being raised as heir to a crown, the loneliness that often came with a life surrounded by advisors and nobles rather than genuine friends. Through these conversations, I came to understand that Ethan's quiet strength had never been about proving anything to anyone. It came from a deep, personal understanding of what true conflict actually cost, an understanding shaped by years of experience that most people in my own court, myself included, had never been forced to confront so directly. His calm was not the absence of feeling. It was the presence of hard-earned wisdom, carried quietly rather than displayed for others to admire. Kaidan's trial took place several weeks after his arrest, a lengthy process that revealed the full scope of his ambitions. He had hoped, through eliminating both my father and myself, to seize the throne under the pretense of restoring order following a supposed human betrayal, planning to blame the attack on Earth operatives in order to justify breaking the alliance entirely and reclaiming the traditional dominance certain noble houses believed the Dominion had lost by choosing peace over conquest. The evidence Ethan and I had gathered, along with additional testimony from guards and staff members who had grown willing to speak once the plot came fully into the open, left little room for doubt regarding Kaidan's guilt. He was formally stripped of his noble standing and exiled from Dominion territory, along with several of the smaller houses that had conspired alongside him, their influence within the court significantly diminished as a result of their involvement. With Kaidan's threat finally removed, and the human alliance more firmly secured than it had ever been before, life within the palace settled into a new, steadier rhythm. Ethan continued his work training palace security, occasionally traveling briefly to Earth to consult with his own government regarding the strengthening partnership between our two worlds. I accompanied him on one such journey, curious to finally see the homeworld that had shaped the man beside me so profoundly. Standing on Earth for the first time, surrounded by a world so different from my own, yet filled with people who greeted me with the same quiet warmth and careful respect Ethan had always shown, I understood fully something Mira had told me many months earlier, back when I still doubted the value of the husband placed beside me. She had said that the quietest creatures were often the ones whose stillness had been earned the hard way, through experiences the rest of us had never had to survive. I finally understood what she meant. Ethan's calm had never been weakness. It had been strength refined through hardship, patience built through genuine wisdom, and a quiet dedication to protecting peace that ran far deeper than any loud display of power I had witnessed among my own people throughout my entire life. Standing beside him, months after first mistaking him for a harmless gift from a defeated world, I finally saw him exactly as he truly was. Not a symbol of surrender, but a symbol of a peace chosen deliberately, defended quietly, and protected with a strength that had never needed to announce itself loudly to be real. As we returned together to the Dominion, ready to continue building the alliance we had both come to genuinely believe in, I understood that the galaxy had misjudged humans as a species too weak to stand against us. In truth, they had simply chosen, wisely and deliberately, not to burn worlds when peace still remained possible, and I no longer feared what might happen should that peace ever be tested again. Whatever came next, I knew, with complete certainty, that I would face it standing beside the one person who had already proven, again and again, exactly how far his quiet strength could reach.